What is it that makes a hero? Is it the actions that you undertake in the furthering of your cause? Is it maybe how you undertake those actions and what it is you're willing to do for that? Or maybe it's why you're willing to take those actions, why you're willing to do those things. In some settings, I feel the answer is much simpler. All it takes to be a hero is being willing to take action at all. So, I know what you're thinking. Why is he ruminating about 4 Heroes of Light? It wasn't on the list. It wasn't requested. It wasn't anything. It was just a game I happened to be playing because I loved the game. Actually, there's a little bit more to it than that, but that's basically what it boils down to. And actually, I was thinking about it. I was in the last dungeon today. Today, obviously. This is going to be some time before you see this video. And playing through it, and I was like, that's kind of odd. I haven't actually thought about doing rumination for this, but for reasons I'll cover in just a moment here, it occurred to me that I might go ahead and see, well, I mean, I could go ahead and try, but, I'm thinking about it, I don't really have much to say about this game. Now, some of you may or may not know this, but I tend to do trial runs of these ruminations, and most of my videos in general, in my head. When I'm in the shower, or when I'm, downstairs cleaning, or whatever. Just kind of doing my chores. I'm just kind of running through my head what I want to say, in general, partially to get myself in the groove of it, partially to, give myself kind of a test run, a rehearsal, and partially to hammer out what I want to talk about. Well, about half an hour later, I was still going, and I was like, okay, you know what? That's probably enough. I probably actually do have some things to say about this game, which admittedly kind of surprised me. I didn't really think I would, but here we are. So 4 Heroes of Light, right? Now, this is going to be kind of a weird rumination, because this is going to be talking about all sorts of stuff all over the place. Let me start with something that's very important. Usually when I do a rumination of a game, especially an RPG, I usually pause and say, I recommend this game, I really recommend this game, or no, really, I recommend this game, or some equivalent thereof. This is actually in the first category. Don't mistake this for quality. I actually really liked this game a lot, to be completely honest with you. I enjoyed the hell out of it. But it is a game you have to walk into knowing what kind of game it is, and not everyone is going to like it. Now, I actually have some notes here. Let's go ahead and check a couple of things here. Oh, and actually, it just occurred to me one other reason that it's kind of appropriate to be ruminating about one of the last Final Fantasies I haven't yet, since the Final Fantasy Marathon is coming up soon. Woo! So, that's your timestamp. This should go up before the marathon starts. If it doesn't, then I've screwed up somehow. But no, seriously. Do I recommend this game? Let's get a few things out of the way right off the front. I'm not going to explain these because I want to talk about these more, but is this a nostalgic game? Yes. This very much feels like an old school RPG. I'm going to talk about that in more length later, but if that's not your thing, then that's not your thing. No harm, no foul. Second point, is it difficult? Yes. This is a pretty hard game. In combat, in structure, in design, it doesn't hold your hand. It doesn't have a tutorial. It just says, go, figure it out. And if you don't, then you die. Now, death is kind of a small penalty in this game, but it's the same small penalty it's been in many Final Fantasies previous to now. FF6 is actually a great example of that. You die, you go back to the save point, but you retain the progress you'd made as far as levels and stuff. Now, there's a caveat to that, but I don't want to get into details too much. So, point being, it is a pretty difficult game, all things considered. Third point, is it graphically beautiful? No. I'm sorry, but this game does not look that impressive. However, one of the things they did was they deliberately tried to go for what I'm going to just start calling a Wind Waker look. Heavily stylized, heavily aesthetically done. Not really cartoony like Wind Waker. That's actually not really a great example, because the character models are kind of leaning that way, but not really. But I'm more talking about the backgrounds and the art of, the scenery and the areas are in, that kind of a thing. Definitely has more of that feel to it than, anything else, really. And one final point I want to toss out at you here. One of the things that really convinced me to pick up this game is the fact that the team that made it is the same team that made Final Fantasy IV DS and Final Fantasy III DS. Two games I have pointed and touted and held up on a frickin' pedestal as arguably some of the best examples, if not the best examples, of proper remakes. So I was already kind of naturally inclined to do it, and a lot of the experiences they gained in those games very much shows through in this one. So if that is relevant to you or something you care about, I just thought I'd mention that as well. I think that's it as far as the recommendation thing. Yeah, I think we'll go ahead and stop there. I mean, everything else I want to talk about in detail. Bottom line is, if you don't want a fairly difficult, low graphics, old style RPG, don't buy this. However, one thing I want to point out is, obviously, I mean, the game has Final Fantasy in the title. It is considered a Gaiden Final Fantasy game, well, ironically, like Seiken Densetsu. I know I don't know how to pronounce it, but Seiken Densetsu 1, aka Sword of Mana. That isn't really a Final Fantasy game either, but it is still actually officially considered a Gaiden game, and this is basically in the same vein. There is one other thing. It has been asked, do I recommend this game for people who have liked the look of Bravely Default? Having played the demo of Bravely Default and beaten the entire game of Four Heroes of Light, I can tell you definitively that Bravely Default, for all intents and purposes, seems to be a superior game. Does that make Four Heroes of Light a bad game? No. Not at all, but it is very clearly in the same general style, and that's what I'm getting to here. Despite the Final Fantasy in the title, think of this more like a Dragon Quest game. If you like the Dragon Quests, 1 through 8, well, 1 through 9, really. I can't speak to 10 because it's not out here. Then I do actually recommend Four Heroes of Light, if you do like the Dragon Quest, excuse me. Now, there is one other thing that's worth mentioning. Four Heroes of Light is on the DS. The reason I mention that is the DS is quickly becoming one of the more accessible consoles to pick up a game for. It's available on a DS, of course, which you can buy for chump change at this point. You can play DS games on the 3DS. DS cartridges are still relatively new enough that for the most part they're not actually all that expensive, unlike, say, Game Boy Advance games, which are already in the $70 and in some cases $90 range. And I don't want to get too much into controversy here, but one thing Nintendo has done that I am very much in favor of recently is the announcement that DS games are going to start showing up on Virtualware for the Wii U, which is awesome. So that's 3 methods of playing this game, and any other DS games. And let me just say one thing really quick. I know this is kind of off topic, but if you haven't played any of the DS library, I recommend it. The DS library is gargantuan. Probably the second or third largest array of games and game types that I have enjoyed personally. Just my opinion, just my preference, but the only things that have actually beaten the DS out in terms of number of games I've enjoyed is the SNES, which is on number 1 slot, and the NES. Just saying. PS2 is next, by the way, for anyone who was wondering. So, let's get into the game proper, shall we? Now, first and foremost, I mentioned the old school thing. We're actually going to talk about this right off the bat, because I think this is really relevant to really dig into this. One of the things that they really deliberately did with this game is they went back and they really tried to have a feel for an old school RPG, not just the structure and mechanics of an old school RPG. In other words, this isn't just and I hate to say this because I don't want to discourage people, but this isn't just an indie clone of Final Fantasy 1 or Dragon Quest 1, or Dragon Quest 3, actually, more accurately. This is actually a game that is a new game with the feel of the old. If I can give you a direct example of what I'm talking about, Mega Man 9, and far better, in my opinion, Mega Man 10, both were definitively new Mega Man games that had all the feel, flavor, charm, etc. of the old original Mega Mans. You follow? So, definitely an enjoyment factor on that, but here's something I find really, really fascinating with the way they do this. I mentioned way back in my Final Fantasy I Rumination that one of the things they were forced to do, the creators were forced to do, was they had to chop their story up. Now, some people do this on purpose. Some people do this, because they have to. Some people do the opposite of this when it comes to storytelling in a video game because of whatever reasons. In this case, time and money. In the case of Final Fantasy 1, they had to chop up the story, so they very specifically and selectively decided what to leave in and what not, with the intent that the player could create their own story, could write in the pieces themselves. That's the kind of thing that's actually pretty hard to pull off, admittedly. But I feel, as I mentioned in my FF1 review, or Rumination, excuse me, I feel like they did pull it off there. Now, this is interesting in its own right, because For Heroes of Light basically pulls the same general approach. Give you just enough pieces of the story for you to fill in the blanks yourself, okay? Now, the reason that's interesting to me is I don't feel like they did that to ape FF1, but rather to get that old school feeling of, and I'm going to explain why in a nutshell. Here's the thing, okay? Older RPGs didn't have as much to work with in terms of software, in terms of time and budget, and in terms of hardware. There were limitations, so they couldn't tell the whole story. Now, I mention that specifically because it's weird to think of it in contrast to modern RPGs, especially JRPGs, where story is flung at you just over and over and over. I call it the exposition bomb. I actually have a note here that just says exposition bomb, because that's basically what the new games do in the approach. Don't put words into my mouth. I'm not saying that's a negative thing. It's just a different approach. And I actually don't malign the writers for doing that, because some of those people worked on those old RPGs and remember how frustrating it was to not be able to tell all of their story. So they throw the exposition bomb, so to speak, and constantly lay out everything, and there's tons of cutscenes, and there's tons of dialogue, and there's tons of everything, because they want to tell all of their story. They want you to understand all the levels of depth and complexity they put into it. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, if I can segue for just a moment here, most writers who are also world builders do this sort of thing whether it sees paper or not. I know some of you know what I'm talking about. Some of you specifically know this because you and I have chatted about the worlds you're building, and I've talked about the Imperium a few trillion times. Let me explain what I'm talking about, okay? This is an event that happens here on the timeline, okay? This event happens. Now, when we're designing this event, we figure out everything that's happening here. All the intricacies, all the details, everything that's the ripple effects over here, and what's happening with these people. And these guys aren't actually involved, but they're over here doing this at the same time. That kind of a thing, hammering out what's happening. And then when you write the story, more often than not, what happens is you only get this little sliver because that's, because of viewpoint perspective, or these are the characters you're following, or whatever you follow, right? But all the rest of that still exists. So one of the things I've felt and I've seen a lot of times as modern RPGs do is they try to explain all of this through one method or another, sometimes successfully, and admittedly sometimes not. All of this is to get across the point that is basically a new feel to this kind of RPG storytelling. The exposition bomb. I hate to keep saying that, but I don't have a better term for it. The old RPG feel, ergo, is to do the exact opposite. And this is very important, there is a difference between putting no story or little story in and deliberately writing out a story and then chopping it up into bits in such a way that you only get certain pieces of it, specifically for the intent of you filling out the rest of the pieces yourself. And that is what For Heroes of Light does. Now, I guarantee you a lot of what I'm going to talk about when I actually get to the story and past the spoiler section of this video is going to be stuff that I am reading too much into it. But for once, I don't even feel the twinge of guilt about that, because it was designed to do that. They wanted me to do that, and I did. And you know what? I enjoy the hell out of that game, partially because of that. As I said in my reading too much into it video, if that actually enhances your enjoyment of a thing, then what is the shame of it? Let's move on to my next point. I only have a small note about this because I don't want to talk about this too much until I get past the spoiler section. I know it's weird to have a spoiler section about a game like this, especially given what I just said, but bear with me. What I want to talk about is a surprisingly deliberate character growth in this game. It's one of those weird things where if you, the player, don't go out of your way to talk to the characters in the sequences you can, you're probably not even going to notice the character growth. Now let me explain what I mean by that. Most RPG players, like myself, do the all NPCs method. And I know a lot of you know what I'm talking about. Even when replaying games, I'll play Chrono Trigger and I'll still go and talk to everybody. But if I was playing Chrono Trigger for the first time, oh man, that was a long time ago. God, that's a good game. And when I was playing it for the first time, I definitely talked to everyone every single time. I went out of my way to because sometimes I know this is weird, but story geek, what do you want from me? I viewed additional information, more character, more story, more lore, more setting, to be a reward. If I would do a quest, do an optional side mission, just to hear what happened as a result of it, just to see the characters move and grow of it. It's one of the things I loved about Chrono Trigger. Is so much of those optional quests were about filling in the holes of these characters. Marl's thing, Frog's thing, Magus's thing, or Janice's thing, if you prefer. Robo's thing. All of these were fleshing out and developing the characters more. Really, that's what it was about. And I loved that. I didn't care about the rewards. I mean, I did. Because, we got to get that rainbow sword. Wow. But my point is, that kind of thing I love. And in Four Heroes of Light, in many cases, there are instances where they're just hanging out. Usually after you beat a boss. Sometimes when you're in town. It doesn't always happen. But, you can go and you can just talk to them. And they'll have just a little bit of a blurb. But if you do that every time, you actually notice their characters changing and developing as the story goes. And that's the awesome part. It's like optional character development, because if you just play the cutscenes and don't talk to everyone, you're going to miss basically all of that. But it's done in such a way that during the cutscenes it almost doesn't matter for that chunk. You know what I mean? With one exception. If you don't talk to him every time, you probably are going to be missing out on the ending. I'll admit that flat. Now, let's go ahead and mention one other thing I like about this game is, in its approach to storytelling, is it likes to play with expectations. And that's literally all I'm going to say until we get to the spoiler section. Okay, hang on. All right. Let's go ahead and talk about the way the game actually works mechanically and fundamentally. Well, actually, you know what? No, we're going to go ahead and stop here, because I think I've told you enough about that. And then we're going to go ahead and end the review. It's over. No, I'm kidding. What I actually want to do is I want to flip over to this other page. Usually I do this first, but I really got on a roll there, and I really wanted to talk about several of the ways this game is awesome. And now we're going to pause and talk about several of the ways this game is not awesome. This is a flawed game. Let's make no mistake. I'm not even sure if I'll ever replay it. I actually probably will. It's not in the I have no interest in replaying it. It's in the I will replay it when I have cheats category. So let's talk about the downsides of this, shall we? First and foremost, the UI really takes some getting used to. It's actually incredibly minimalistic on purpose, and I really don't know what else to say about that. Like, okay, in order to actually, you pull up the menu, and what happens is you see your character thing and your item thing over here. Except this isn't actually your items. This is your quest items, your key items. And this, it pulls up your items, your abilities, and your classes, assuming you even have classes at this point, because, you have to earn those first. Okay, you're probably thinking, well, where's all the information? Well, if you pull up items or abilities, you will learn what your stats are, how much X to level, and that kind of thing, right? And also see what your current appearance is. You can also move them around with that thing, although to be completely honest, I didn't actually realize that at first. And that's basically it. It is incredibly minimalistic, and it bugged the crap out of me the first, I don't know, 3-4 hours I was playing. It really took me to... I had to just chunk over here and mentally adjust for it, so I want to mention that. Speaking of the UI, let's talk about inventory management. Now, this is going to sound kind of weird, but I've always felt that Resident Evil 4 had a really good inventory management system. The reason why was because you had a set amount of space to work with, and it rewarded you for being smart about how you carried it. And everything had different variable sizes. A gun took up like this space, but a little herb took up this space, And so you could, put a bunch of herbs over here and get some spare ammunition, put some grenades here, and have the big old gun right here and all this. It encouraged you to actually think about your inventory. Some systems, and there are several games and RPGs and other games that have an inventory that have done this, don't actually encourage you to think about it, but kind of like halfway go to that, and this is an example of that. in the Resident Evil example, picture if instead of, the different sizes and you have the big old thing, imagine you have like 9 squares basically, and every item that you have, period, takes up 1 square. And that's just kind of irritating to me. And that's what 4 Heroes of Light does. But there's actually 2 catches to this. Number 1, your equipment takes up inventory space too. And number 2, so do your spells. So your inventory, spells, and equipment all go in that same dinky little equipment slot. And not to spoil too much, I guess this isn't really spoilers, but for a decent chunk of the game, you're not playing with all 4 characters. For anybody who's played any game like that, Earthbound comes to mind immediately, you know what it's like to have a limited inventory and only have 1 of them, or 2 of them, or 3 of them. You get my point. Until you get all 4, you're just constantly cramming for space everywhere to hold everything. I really feel like if they had taken in, all they would have had to do, in my honest opinion, is take spells and equipment out of the equation. Put it on a different bar, put it on a different inventory screen, something. So you have your inventory and then like your gear or whatever. And that would have solved a lot of those problems. But as it was just frustrating. And I have to mention something, I made an extra little note here. Torches. Those of you who've played Dragon Quest I know just how frustratingly irritating torches can be. Let me say this flat. Like those survival mods I like to use on Skyrim, that sort of thing is fun if I'm in the mood for it. If I'm not, it's just irritating. And I know I'm not alone in this. If I were to summarize that sentence, it would be that kind of stuff should be optional. Torches in Dragon Quest I and in 4 Heroes of Light are not optional. And you can barely see what the hell you're doing if you don't happen to have torches on hand. And of course the torch is consumed when you use it, and when you leave the area, the torch is gone, and if you go back in, it's dark again. Yeah. With one exception, which I'll talk about later, that just irritated the crud out of me. I mentioned the graphics already, so I don't really feel like I have to talk about that. Let's go ahead and, while we're talking about little things that irritated me over time, let's talk about the gem upgrade system. Put simply, because I'll go ahead and talk about it here, this is overall a cool system, don't mistake me. It's not a bad system, so don't mistake this as saying it's bad. I know I'm kind of confusing my order here, but just bear with me. In order to upgrade your equipment, which is weapons, shields, and armor, and your classes, you slot gems into them, and that upgrades them. You follow? Thought I heard something. Anyways, sorry, there's been storm warnings all day today, and I've been... Anyways, so when they upgrade, they get better, they get more abilities, that kind of thing, and gems are things you find off of mobs. It's basically the equivalent of gold. You actually don't really get gold. Actually, you don't get gold at all, if I'm not mistaken, from enemies. What you do get is gems and occasionally items. Now, of course, gems are a primary source of loot for, obtaining gold. But on top of that, you use these gems for upgrading. It's a nice little system because you have to balance your needs out, right? Cool system. Small irritant. Weapons, shields, and armor upgrade 9 times. And they don't actually get progressively more expensive to upgrade, which is a good thing. The catch is that means basically when you're upgrading something, generally you're upgrading it all 9 times in one setting. A fill all button would have been incredibly useful for that, or the use of the touchpad. Either one of these things could have really assisted in this process, because what it is you have to manually select with the D-pad, gem here, 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 next gem here, 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 gem here, here. Yes. Okay, do it again. Gem here, here, here. And where the D-pad goes on the design of the shield, because you actually see a shield here, or you actually see the armor, or you actually see the crown, or whatever. It's not really that intuitive, and it's just kind of a little annoying, especially when you're upgrading everyone's gear to 9. And, oh my god. A fill-all button would have been very helpful, is all I'm saying. One other thing I want to talk about is the guide, or rather lack of one. As I mentioned, this game doesn't even have a tutorial. That's actually one of the common features I've heard about it, but one of the important things is if you don't have a walkthrough of some kind, it is possible that you're just going to not really be enjoying the game as much as you could be. It's rare that I will suggest a game and say, by the way, please play it with a walkthrough, but this is one of those. Here's the thing, you don't have to. In some cases, I don't know if you have the same problem as me or other gamers like me, but sometimes I just have no idea where to go next. And this game is hard, as I mentioned, so if I go roaming off over here and into this cave and find out there's nothing there, I have wasted time, resources, material, etc. doing that, and I haven't really gained it much out of it other than pain, and time wasted. So I come back here and I'm like, where the heck am I supposed to go? This happened several times in this game, and I finally just actually one time. I'm sorry, I got to share this story. I was actually playing this game in Vegas recently. I was visiting family. Don't give me that look. Most of my family lives in Vegas, and my grandparents live there too. Really nice house. Actually, I shouldn't say Vegas. They live in the Vegas area, but you get the point. I was down there, and I'd brought my DS to entertain myself. I brought Mario 64 on the DS, which I enjoyed the hell out of. By the way, another proper remake. Brilliant game. Not really much to ruminate about, so that's my recommendation. Buy it. And for Heroes of Light. And I got to a point where I was just flat stuck, and I'd gone over here, and I explored the cave, and then I died, and then I went over here, and died, and then I went over here. Finally, I texted Pax, and I said, Pax, could you look up where the hell I'm supposed to go? And I dropped a few names so he could search in the walkthrough for where I'm supposed to go next. And he was like, well, apparently you're supposed to do this and this and this and talk to this guy. And he said it wrong, but based on what he said, I was like, oh, it's back in the frickin' town, and I gotta talk to that one guy. And this is why, because For Heroes of Light does what most old school RPGs did. They're heavily trigger-based. You cannot advance the plot. It's the insurmountable waist-high wall kind of a thing. There's actually a trope for this. I can't remember the name of it, but the idea is you cannot progress in the game without bugs or glitches or whatever until you go hit the trigger. And usually the trigger is that guy over there who there's basically no reason whatsoever to talk to him, or that object over there which there's basically no reason to decide. You get where I'm going with this. And so without a guide, those kind of things can be a little bit frustrating, obviously, because I was like, Pax, where the heck am I supposed to go? But with the guide, you know where you're supposed to go next. Don't read too far ahead. Just, like, okay, play. I know some friends, too, who will play until they get stuck, like I did, and then say, okay, pull up the guide. Aha. But even ignoring that, there are some things in this game you just kind of miss out on if you don't actually have a guide. Optional stuff you can't get later on, things that you shouldn't get rid of, that kind of a thing, It's one of those things. So I do recommend you play it with a guide, and that I am going to put that in a negative, just especially for a handheld game. But let's move on. Let's talk about the biggest negative, which I've been saving for last. It's the last negative, okay? Sorry about that. Long story short, this game has auto-targeting. Now, let me elaborate a little bit, okay? Those of you who have played the Dragon Quest series know that in some of the games they have an auto function, and in mostly the remakes and the more modern games, 9 is a great example of this, that AI basically cheats. It knows when you select them to do auto, they can and will change their action based on the events that happened in that turn. Now, if you don't really understand what I'm saying, let me explain this. Let's say you're the main character and you attack this guy, and you've got 3 party members, okay? So you attack, that's your action, and you set the other 3 to auto. They poison you, and this guy hits him, and this guy defends, okay? Your 3 party members can, if set up properly with the AI, because there's different AI scripts you can set up in Dragon Quest, get rid of the poison on him, cure him, and attack the person who's not defending. In other words, it's a smart AI. But again, as I say, it's cheating because you can't do that. You didn't know he would be poisoned, and you didn't know he would be hit. But the AI can in turn. You see where I'm going with this? And I feel like that was the intent they were going with when they did this, and for whatever reason it didn't solidify, because what we have is much worse than that. Instead, when you cannot choose targets. You still select actions for all 4 of your party members, but you can't choose targets for them. Now, there is a catch, and I actually didn't learn this till very far in, because I'm an idiot, apparently, but melee attacks, martial attacks, will always start... Well, I guess over here on... What is your perspective? Whatever. I'm going to use my perspective. Melee attacks will always attack over here on the left, moving to the right, so it will always hit the leftmost mobs first, and magic attacks will always start on the right. That's... But the catch is, that can be very frustrating. It can involve a lot of situations, most of which are site-specific, but for a game that's already hard, being screwed over by the AI, by the auto-targeting, I should say, picking the wrong target, can kind of hurt. Really good example of that is status effects. trying to get rid of status effects. I'll give you a direct example. This actually happened to me. 4 party members, right? This one on the far right is petrified. This one is poisoned, and these 2 are fine. So I have this one do Isuna, or Isona, or however you're supposed to say that. And they get rid of the poison. Okay. Well, then I have them do it again, and during the next course of the next round, he got poisoned, so that poison is now removed. Okay. Next round, get rid of that frickin' petrify so he can get exp. Oh no, I beat the enemy, so he doesn't actually get experience from that. It's a little irritating, you know? Now, alright, that's it. We're done with the bad. Let's go ahead and talk about the good as far as gameplay, because we're already kind of in a gameplay thing here. I already mentioned the gem system and the class system. Let's talk about the class system a bit. This is a little bit closer to Final Fantasy III's class system. I mentioned the distinction for those of you who's not fully aware. Most RPGs that do a class system do what I like to call the Final Fantasy Tactics or Final Fantasy V system. In other words, you level up a class, that class has special abilities, and in leveling that class up with whatever alternate advancement it is, you gain pieces of that class, special abilities, special attacks, whatever, that you can then equip regardless of class. FF5 and Tactics are both great examples of this, and, Bravely Default does this too, I might add. This does the FF3 system, which is still a class-based, but once you're in a class, you're basically locked into that class. You can only use abilities from that class, you only gain the benefits of that class. However, as long as you're out of combat, you can swap at will. And swapping at will is actually highly encouraged. I strongly recommend you don't just pick one party for this game. And I'll talk about why in a little bit. But that's basically where it's at. Now, as I mentioned, you use gems to upgrade those classes. That's the alternate advancement of this game. What that does, and this is important because this is the thing. All it really does, and I recommend a guide for this if you're concerned, is give you more abilities from that class. The passive ability of the class doesn't change. The stats don't change. All that changes is the abilities you have access to. Now that's important because in some cases that class's extra abilities aren't actually useful. The class itself is useful, but there's no reason to go ahead and blow gems on it. You see where I'm going with this? So just a word of warning. The other thing though, this is really awesome, and one of the reasons I'm really excited about Bravely Default is this reason right here, okay? Man, I'm just running out of breath today. Every class has some use. Now let me explain what I mean by that. In most games with class systems in general, I don't know where to put this, there we go. In most games that have a class system, you're going to have classes that are basically useless or only exist for prerequisites. Final Fantasy Tactics is actually a pretty good example of this. There are some classes you basically just get and level to get their abilities or to get to this point or whatever, and then you move on. You never look back at them. 4 Heroes of Light is the exact opposite of that. There is not a single class in that game, and yes, I did the optional stuff, I did the towers, that I did not actually have a desire to or reason to use at some point or another. 2 ways they did this. 3, really. Number 1, they were really smart about the design for their enemies. A lot of the bosses are, in their own way, puzzle bosses. What they do and how they do it can basically wreck you, despite being a decent level, if you don't have a good setup specifically to kill that boss. By the way, this is apparently true in Bravely Default as well. Just pointing it out. But my point is, you cannot approach, well you can if you're ludicrously overleveled or you've got a special setup or you're lucky, but in general you're not intended to approach every single boss with the same strategy. You adapt your strategy to that fight, and I like that personally. It's a great way to add both strategy and difficulty to a turn-based RPG. Especially one with customization like this one. But you see where I'm going with this. Because they custom tailor each boss to basically be encouraging a different strategy, what you can do is then make it so that class A, B, and C, which don't look useful, are useful on that, And so, like I said, basically every class does see its use for that reason. The second reason is the obvious one. They really worked with the abilities on each thing. No class has anything that's particularly overpowered, with the theoretical exception of the Black Mage, and Black Mage, Desolator, Spell Focus. But no class really is particularly overpowered, so you're never really discouraged from trying new things out and just kind of saying, oh, let's see what this job does, let's see what this job does. And as I mentioned, there's literally no penalty for switching, which is an improvement from, say, Final Fantasy III, for example, where you actually are penalized for switching classes. So that's pretty awesome too. The third reason, though, I like this one. This is the reason most games that have classes get this right. Combos. There are certain combinations of classes and their abilities that you use in proper conjunction in your party that make them useful. I believe Monk is actually the class I'm thinking of. And no, it's not what you're thinking. If you haven't played this game, I'll talk about that in just a moment. But the Monk's ability, if used properly, can actually be really, really devastating if you set him up with the proper classes on the other three, have them do their stuff, and then have them die, so the Monk now has the triple power, the buffs, and the Lux thing, and all that fun stuff. You get where I'm going with this. It's actually possible to create very strong combinations with the classes. So all of them have a use, and that's awesome. But here's the other thing. I wanted to talk about this too. I like how they branched out with the classes. Now, I admit I am guilty of this too. A lot of us look at classes and we think FF1. Really, that's what it boils down to. Sometimes we branch out to FF3 or FF5, but that really is what it comes down to. Black mage, white mage, fighter, ninja, thief, and occasionally that's it. And sometimes we'll branch out just a little bit more, but it's all the basics, the classic classes. This thing has, I actually don't have the full list, and the game's off right now, and I don't want to go lunging for it just to look at it. But you get my point. There are a new number of classes here that are brand new. A lot of them are very different. One of the interesting things is of the first, I believe, like 10 or so classes, there are only 2 that are melee based at all, and one of them is the very first one you get, the Wanderer's hat, the Wanderer's class, and the other one is the fighter, who only gets a bonus to attacks if he has no weapons equipped. In other words, he is what most people consider the monk. And I just think that's really cool that they actually bothered to branch out on that. And they created the shaman, who is heavily elemental, and they created the storyteller, and so forth and so on. There's some really good classes in there. But that brings me another thing I want to mention. Like I said, this game is actually very aesthetic in its design. They were going for a very specific artistic appeal, deliberately. I call it the Wind Waker effect, like I said. It's not trying to be good looking, it's trying to look like this, well. And one of the other things they did was make each class look pretty distinct, all things considered. Some of them are kind of, not really my thing. The merchant, but some of them are really cool looking, and even if I don't particularly like them personally, I like how they branched out with it. I like how they tried to make, because all it changes is the head, because you're actually literally wearing crowns. That's your class, right? But they tried to branch it out so each thing looked distinct, but also had its own particular aesthetic style to it. You know what I'm going? I'm going for here? Holy moly! So let's go ahead and move on to minigames. Now, minigames is interesting in this game because there's only 2 that I'm aware of, not counting optional stuff. The reason minigames are interesting in this game is because they were both fun and they were both well designed. And that's pretty cool in my opinion. I actually just talked about this with regards to Birth by Sleep, but it's obvious they put more effort into these. Here's the funny catch about this, okay? The first minigame we're going to talk about is the math minigame, and that's basically all we're going to say. It is math problems. If you don't like that kind of thing, you're not going to like this. And there's not really a guide. There's no cheat way to do it. There's just ways to help you solve the problems in a certain way. Because the goal, other than just having fun with it, of course, is if you get a certain high score, you actually gain a new crown, a new class as a result of that. The other minigame, though, I guarantee a lot more people will like, and that is the Turnico game, or Tornico, or Tornico? I have no idea how to pronounce that guy's name. I'm talking about the guy from Dragon Quest IV, for those of you who have not picked up on this. It is a merchant minigame, and it's actually a lot of fun. What you do is you buy items, and you have... It's weird, because you can buy, I believe it's up to 6 items. Well, okay, you can sell, actually, up to 6 items. And you have so many, high-priced, middle-priced, low-priced, undercut, that kind of thing. You only have so many allotments. You can't just crank the prices up on everything. You only have like 2 things you can really crank up the price up, and 3 things you can kind of crank up the price up, and so forth and so on. And you have to pay attention to the trends in the city at the moment, which you can find out by just talking to people out and about in town and so forth, in order to figure out what's going to sell and how. And in addition to the fact that it's basically a ludicrous source of money, it's just kind of fun, in the same way the Tornico thing was. Tornico? Nah. Tornico. That's what I usually say in my head, so that's what I'm going to say out loud. The Tornico game was back in Dragon Quest IV. It's just playing merchant, and then you go out and you get more stuff to sell, and you go back and you play merchant. I liked it. And again, it's really useful, too, which is nice. I only have 3 notes to say about the optional dungeons. 4, actually, excuse me. They are randomized. So you can't look up a guide. You can look up a general idea of the kind of things you'll fight, the types of enemies you'll fight, and the types of chests you'll encounter within each tower. But that's it. So they're randomized, which I think is good. They're hard. They are difficult. They are punch you in the face difficult, which I think is good for optionals. And what is effectively, these 4 towers are effectively the super optional of this game. If you want to really narrow it down, the final boss, the boss at floor 100 of Tower 4 would be the super optional of the game. But either way, this stuff is hard. In a good way, though. As weird as that sounds, they are long, as I just kind of hinted at, 100 floors each tower. And as you go up the tower, the size of the floor just kind of increases. It's actually funny when you think about it. And finally, they are rewarding. You go there, you get the best equipment, you get tons of experience, tons of gems. It's basically the only source, a reliable source, I should say, of certain gems. And you get the optional crowns, which are all either useful situationally or useful no matter what. It's good stuff, right? In fact, that's where you get the Storyteller crown, which is the ultimate crown, so to speak. So good stuff all told. One last point before we get into the story stuff. Like I said, this isn't actually going to be a really long video, so I do apologize, but I really wanted to talk about it, so I hope you're tolerating me, especially with my out-of-breath problem I'm having right now. My nose is really clogged up, so I'm having trouble breathing. One of the things they do that I think is actually really cool, I can actually demonstrate this visually here, okay, is the terrain isn't actually flat anywhere. Well, it is in dungeons, but in towns and in the overworld, it actually is curved like this, right? Now, that serves 2 important purposes. One, it gives you a actual visual feeling of moving around and doing stuff. As you're moving around at the overworld map is actually kind of, and there's the horizon over there, and then you go back, but then the horizon kind of dips down below, and you can't see it anymore. It's a nice little thing. FF7 did this to some extent or another. A few other games have done this, but the other reason they did this is actually the same reason FF7 did this. Load times. They can actually add, and do add, more in art assets to towns and to the overworld map than they otherwise would have been able to with the DS's hardware, because only a fairly small portion of it is actually loaded at one point in time. And I think that's awesome, and it's creative use of it in a way to actually emphasize the story of the game, the feeling of it, etc. However, I do have to be honest with you, it can be irritating if you don't know where you're going, because as I just highlighted, you're actually only seeing about this band of it. Because here's the horizon over here, and you can't see past this, And so you see this up to about here, and as you move around, this is your viewpoint. So if you don't know that you're supposed to go up here, you could kind of go, well, I don't know. Whether that's a good or a bad thing is going to be up to your opinion, but I wanted you to go in informed. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about spoilers. Let's go ahead and get into the spoiler section. I know it's weird to have a spoiler section for this, and the reason why I'm going to talk about right now, for anybody who hasn't already left, if you want to play this game, if you have any intention of picking up this game and play it, please stop the video now and don't listen to my spoilers. These are the kind of spoilers that just knowing what they are will ruin, in my opinion, the experience of them. I mean, I guess that's the definition of spoilers, but you get my point, right? These are minor things, it was his sled. Is probably still more significant than the kind of spoilers we have here, but you get my point, right? That being said, we're not going to go into spoilers immediately. I just want to talk about a few points here. Really only a couple. First and foremost, one of the things I find interesting about this world that this setting occurs in is it's kind of screwed up. Now, this ties into my point at the very end, but I want to mention this first because just think about this for a moment. Even ignoring the spoilers, fact that demons are actually running everything behind the scenes and trying to ruin the world, even ignoring that fact, the world is actually kind of messed up. Really, it is. This town has pirate problems. This town has people who are poor living on the streets. This town, in rags and stuff. This town over here is living in bitterness and cold, and this guy over here is living just with his anger and rage issues. You get where I'm going with this. No matter where you go, this place is screwed up. And it's kind of funny in its own right because it's an interesting type of screwed up, which is the second point I really want to talk about. Most times when you have a situation like this, in an RPG especially, you want to portray a world that is either unaware of how doomed it is, or is basically doomed and everybody knows it, To give you a direct example of what I'm talking about, in FF7, nobody was aware of the peril, because this is an example of both. Nobody was aware of the peril until Meteor showed up overhead, and then everyone was. And though it was a changed world after that, it was a post-Meteor world. You know what I mean? Another good way to point this out is, in a game like FF4, for example. I'm sorry for keep going to the FFs, just bear with me. War is happening, and monsters are everywhere, and the situation just seems to be getting worse everywhere you are. Everyone is aware of their doomed status, of the fact that they are on the brink. Four Heroes of Light pulls off, in my opinion, a kind of unique variant of that, because the world is kind of crapsack. There is problems everywhere. There are problems everywhere. But they're all isolated. They're all small. They're all localized. It's only when you consider the fact that everywhere, when you actually have the perspective to pull back here and see that everywhere is screwed up, differently but simultaneously, that you really think of how messed up the world is. Nobody thinks they're on the brink because they're just thinking about their local problems. You see where I'm going with this? And it's an interesting perspective of that, and probably done deliberately both in character and out. Like I said, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. But I want to also talk about the layers to this game. As I mentioned, the character development was rather surprising, but one of the things I like is that, as I said earlier, they play with your expectations. Very first mission you get is a mission to go save a princess who has been robbed by a person from a king in a kingdom. That should sound familiar. It is done deliberately to evoke memories and feelings of not only old RPGs in general, Dragon Quest I and FF1 both being the big ones here, but of that general style of quest. Go out, save the princess, right? I mean, hell, even Mario did that. And yet, the game immediately hits you across the knees with it, because you go out, you save the princess, you come back, the town is all stone. Why is the town all stone? And this is the beautiful part. They don't answer why for a really long time. We know the general gist of it. There was a curse. But that's all we know. We don't know why. We didn't know what. We don't know specifically, any specifics whatsoever, actually. It's a mystery that just lingers there. And what we end up learning is that there was more to it than we thought, with the king actually not being the king. Which brings me to my second point. One of the things I loved about this is that until you actually come back after the time crash, you have no idea that the king is an imposter. In virtually every other instance when you see this, when you see the evil chancellor or the monster impersonating the king trope, or cliche, or whatever you want to call it, in an RPG, and let's be honest, that was a very common thing in older RPGs, it's pretty obvious that they're evil, the secretly evil guy. FF4 is probably my favorite example of that. Granted, I like it in FF4 because knowing they were evil wasn't the point. It was trying to... I don't want to defend it here. I'll talk about that when I do my marathon. The point is, in FF4, it was blatantly obvious that both Bagan and the king of Baron were both just ludicrously evil, and there was something wrong with them. They even had the classic line, "The king hasn't been the same since blah blah blah," when you talk to the NPCs in town. That just has a giant neon sign over it saying, "They're secretly possessed or possibly a monster." Now, it can work, as in the case of FF4, but this game didn't do that. The king acted completely perfectly normally, until you really think about it. The characters in-game actually call out to this. They say, well, I guess this explains why, they sent us after this, why they didn't give us more materials or equipment to do this, blah, 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 blah. Because he was secretly evil. He was, I don't even remember who, but it was one of the big demon dudes. And yet, my point here is that it was wonderfully done because there was no sign of it. Not really, up until you get to that point. It was subtle in a wonderful way because it was so obvious. Because it's just go save the princess. And you don't think about a quest like that. Alright, saving the princess. And then you come back and you realize, oh shoot, maybe I should have thought about that. This is only one example of this. I don't want to list all of them. But that's probably my favorite example of this game playing with your expectations and making you think A, and then having you realize, oh, well, it's B. And then having you realize, oh, it's actually C. You know where I'm going. Don't mistake this for a convoluted or complicated plot, because it's not. It just plays with the story in ways that I actually enjoy, and that's all I'm saying. Speaking of which, what do we got here? 3 more things here. Well, 4 more points, really, and then I'll just talk about the ending, and then we'll be done here. I don't even need my notes now. First of all, One of the things I like, and this ties into the overall theme, this will be the last thing I talk about. I've already mentioned it once. This is the second time I mentioned it. One of the things I like is that there is a strong theme of the fact that there is so much darkness in all the people of the world that it's just this cancerous, poisonous mess. We see this in Roland because he is actually absorbing all of it into him. And it takes us going there twice, I might add, in order to break him out of it and, free him from all this darkness that has poisoned his mind. And yet, the thing that's really horrifying about that, and it's more horrifying the more you think about it, we freed all of that darkness from him. But it was so much that it was enough to envelop the entire world in darkness and break time. Yes, really, I've referred to it before already, the time crash. And I'll talk about that more in just a moment. But the more you think about that, the more horrifying that really sounds, although it is fitting. Because near as we can tell, the world of darkness, the actual world of darkness, wasn't showing up yet. Nothing was actually happening. Chaos wasn't really active. Obviously, his lieutenants were running around trying to make things worse in order to add to the darkness, but as long as Roland was around absorbing it all, we weren't actually having an issue. It is when we actually freed Roland from that, trying to save the world, that we doomed the world. And that's one of the things I like about the way they use the time crash. A lot of games do I believe the trope is called nice job breaking it, hero. And it basically means exactly what it sounds like, when you, the hero, do something trying to do right and end up doing wrong. For a ludicrously extreme example of this, look at Chrono Cross, probably the most stark example of you just constantly making things worse throughout the whole game. Well, not the whole game, but you know what I mean. It's like 70%, something like that. Um, in this game, and in some games, they will do that, but because of the way that circumstances are, because of the way how things have been broken, now you have a chance to set it right. And it's a chance you might not have had before. Actually, Birth by Sleep, it's funny because I just played these two games. Birth by Sleep is a pretty good example of this too, and this is no exception. You have broken the world, darkness is everywhere, the world of darkness is going to come up, and yet because of the time crash, see, now here's the way they present the time thing, and I mentioned I'd talk about that in a moment. The way they present it is very vaguely and on purpose, but just from a little bit of logical thinking we can determine that the way it works is each particular area is at a certain point in time. You follow? Most of these are in the past in some way or another. Some of them are closer to the present or the future, but when you move around and change events, then they move with you, if you understand what I mean. Horn is a good example of this. So as you're going through, and Spelvia, that's the other really big one. As you're going through, you are basically altering the past in order to fix the present, and that's how it's enabled you to do this. Now, it's a hard work thing. You have to go off and basically stop the demons I mentioned earlier, the lieutenants, from enacting their plans pretty much before they started, for all intents and purposes. But you succeed, and in so doing, you fix all those problems and fix all the things that happened, 15 years ago or however. I believe it's like 10 to 15 years ago, something like that. These are kids, as usual, but it's in that range, because we know one of the characters was born during this period in the time crash, so we have a pretty good idea of how long ago it was. My point is, they're intentionally vague, and it works. We always have that sense that we're kind of in the past, kind of in the present in some places, kind of in the present, kind of in the past in other places. You know what I mean? And it works well because it flows well with the story and always gets across the theme of it, which is what I mentioned earlier, that now that we can go back and correct things before they go wrong. And yet, here's the real theme of it. Because we go back, because of all the things we do, fixing the world step by step, we have created a world now where all of this darkness has been subsumed back into the world of darkness, which then gives the world of darkness itself the direct power and impetus to just arise and start enveloping the world itself. Because when we do this, we fix the time crash, and then the world of darkness comes up and we have to go back and deal with that problem. Now, so again, nice job breaking it, hero, but again, it's broken in just such a way that we can go stop it if we do it now and if we do it right. And I like the way they get across that idea. Obviously, it's a video game, so it doesn't actually work this way, but in story purposes, you have a very limited window to get to the world of darkness, get to the bottom of the world of darkness, and stop chaos before he just wins. But we do, because we had that window. I think that's really well done. Actually, I lied. I want to look at my notes one more time because I thought there was one other thing I wanted to talk about before. Oh, yes, there was. I mentioned this a while ago. I said that there was one time I liked the torches thing, and it was actually in the Star Chamber. The Star Chamber itself is actually really atmospheric, all things considered. There's really no better way to get across it. And I just want to pause for a moment and say that I really like the way they designed it. I could read into it plenty, but what I like about it is, as you're descending down, it's coral. It's chunks of rock. It's places that have been displaced by sea. It has a very underwater cave feel to it until you get down to the very bottom as you're descending more and more to the earth, and then you're actually in the cosmos, and that's where the actual last dungeon is, in the amongst the stars themselves, aka in the world of darkness itself. That's why they call it the Star Chamber, after all. But while you're going through the undersea cave area, it is pitch black. And it's the one and only time where I felt that the necessity of needing a torch to be able to see actually added to the atmosphere. In actual fact, I did a fair amount of the dungeon without a torch. And I kind of recommend it to you too, because let me tell you, when you're descending into this cave in the ocean, in the path towards the world of darkness, having it be virtually pitch black really can add to the atmosphere. That obviously you're going to have to turn it on at some point because it is a bit of a maze, but at least for the first bit, do yourself a favor and don't use a torch. It's pretty cool. Now, let's talk about the big thing. I actually had a theory which I then shot down myself about this game. I'll go ahead and tell you the theory. I don't really agree with it anymore, but I want you to see where I was coming from. The theory is that Chaos was in fact a former hero. However, after going through his fight, after beating him, seeing the cutscene leading up to the third and final fight, by the way, oh my god, that was a brutally hard fight. It was awesome. And then watching the ending, I've totally changed my mind on that. You see, what I believe the true theme of Four Heroes of Light is the fact that heroes and the villain are just a part of the life of this world. Now, let me make this clear really quick. I could really extrapolate. I could really go and genuinely read too much into this. I could talk about human existence. I could talk about the need for struggle. I could talk about inevitable futility of entropy. I could talk about all sorts of things like that. But I'm just throwing it out the window because I think the base point by itself does stand significantly enough and is interesting enough by itself. And that is the idea that this is a world that just lives like an RPG does. And I know that sounds kind of meta, but that's really what it is. Villain, slow rise, defeat of the villain, peace, and then another slow rise of darkness as things get worse until the villain shows up again, and then we have peace. How many RPGs have there been where it's like 1,000 years ago, or 20,000 years ago, or 600 bagrillion years ago? I don't even want to talk about that. How many RPGs are there where, blank period of time ago, this horrible old evil was stopped but not defeated, and now we have to defeat it? But in Four Heroes of Light, they make it pretty clear that this just kind of keeps happening. That this isn't even the first or second time it's happened. And it will happen again. They guarantee it will happen again. But unlike most of the time where that kind of thing is just bluster on the part of the villain, or the heroes say, we will always be ready to fight you or whatever, the heroes accept that because that is the nature of this world and this life. Because that's the way the humanity is in this world. The way it works is there's enough good in people and enough evil in people to basically cancel each other out. And over time, as bad things happen, this evil part, this darkness, just kind of builds up until it reaches a point where it will reach critical mass. And then heroes will arise, fix the problem, and this will go back down again. It's maintenance. But it's wonderful in its approach to it. Because the real message here, and as I mentioned, this ties into a lot of earlier things, is the idea that these four kids were not the chosen ones. That they weren't special. That thing I said right at the beginning. What defines a hero? This game says very adamantly and very clearly it is the willing choice to take action. That's all. These four kids were the heroes because they did it. Because they were the ones willing to try, willing to work on it. And that's why the crystals were like, okay, you then, here, have power. And as you're going through the ending, spoiler alert, of course, and giving back all the legendary items, there's a wonderful line I love where it's like, all these legendary items helped us. We need to put them back so that when the next people show up, they can use them too. And there's another line too where it's like anybody could have done what we did. We were just the ones who did it. And that ties into that point of that cycle, that the nature of the way this world works. That when it happens again, they know with certainty, without dread, without gloom, and without pointless idealistic or senseless, foolish optimism, they say with certainty, with confidence, next time around, there will be more heroes, just like we were, who will deal with it just like we did, and just like the guys before us did. Each time, there will be heroes. We know this. So let's just go ahead and make sure everything's back where it is, so when they need it, it'll be there. It's actually the Sisyphus thing. Sisyphus thing, if you think about it from Greek mythology. I know this is a weird topic, but bear with me. A lot of people have looked at that as the ultimate dichotomy between hope and despair. And I like that because I agree, because the difference between hope and despair is your mindset, not the reality of the situation. Let me explain a little bit. You could say that because this will always happen and because of this cycle, that this is a despairing situation. You could look at it, in other words, you're looking at it with the perspective of evil will always come back. And yet, you could also look at it from the other side of the hopeful situation of good will always fight back. Sisyphus can be considered either despair or hope embodied, because either he will never succeed at his task, for despair, or he will never give up on his task, hope. You see where I'm going with that? Because hope is a powerful thing in its own right, but it only is a thing until you've accomplished it. And so I feel like this game very much strongly builds on the hope idea of that, the eternal hope, that we will constantly be fighting back against the waves and see another tomorrow. And I like that. And I think that's awesome. And that is why I recommend this game to anybody who can put up with it. Now, I've run out of things to say, so I'm going to go ahead and bow out. I'm not going to talk about the multiplayer, because I didn't play it, and I don't have anybody to play with. I'm a sad loser. No, I just don't know anybody who actually owns the game. That's the truth of it. But reality here is that I've run out of things to say, so I hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you later.